people talk about the importance of, diversity, equity, inclusion, and now they add belonging there. And I think belonging is the one that is in some ways the easiest to do and the least controversial. For me, belonging is being interested enough in another person to engage them around their stuff, whatever that happens to be. And again, I mean their appropriate stuff, so that they feel like they can bring that, into the environment we're in, whether it's work or a social organization or a charity or whatever we happen to be doing. And that doesn't take a heck of a lot of effort. It takes intentionality, by the way. It does take intentionality for most of us. I'm not wired that way. I have to think about it. But it doesn't take a huge amount of effort. It just takes a little bit of thought. And so one of the ways I do it is in environments where I feel very comfortable myself. I tend to be much better at helping other people feel like they belong. And one of my kind of growth edges for the future is really trying to ally myself with people in places where I don't feel as comfortable, where I don't feel like I belong that much. Because my theory is they may not either. And together we can create an environment where we do belong.
That's John Mitchell, an executive coach and attorney and the founder of KM Advisors. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. John Mitchell is a lawyer, a leader, and the owner of KM Advisors and Quandary Consulting. John is an organizational strategy consultant and an executive coach. John is also a graduate of Northwestern University School of Law and co-founder of the Chicago Bar Association Leadership Institute. Known as the Purple Coach, John specializes in helping law firms and helping lawyers and leaders discover and maximize their potential. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, John has been a sought-after speaker in many different industries, including healthcare, transit, international development. John and I have worked together as colleagues, and our companies have collaborated on helping leaders build self-awareness about their impact on others, targeting behaviors for change and internalizing those changes. Today, we're going to have a discussion that goes broader than lawyers and deeper than work and goes into our sense of belonging. We share a belief that better leaders do make better lives for employees and organizations, and better employees and organizations lead to a better world. But we also believe that there's so much more to life than work. Today, we're going to talk about building and finding a sense of belonging. So, John, I just wanted to thank you for coming on the podcast for the second time. Over time, you were one of our earliest guests, and over time, the episode that we did on the well-being of lawyers has become quite a popular episode. And over that time, I've had a lot of attorneys and leaders in the legal profession reach out to say that how helpful it's been. And then there's one example of a law firm in the UK that made it required listing for their managers. And, around that time, we were also having separate conversations about the importance of belonging. And enough about me to know that, while I'm an outgoing person, sort of like having privacy and being able to focus on things is super important to me. So one of the things I have to push myself on is building affiliation and belonging for my team. And, that's one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin for me is that having a sense of belonging and a sense of community has been so important to me as a person, even though I don't necessarily know how to build it. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation.
Well, thanks, Jason. I'm excited to be back and always enjoy chatting with you. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And thanks for sharing the feedback. That's the first I heard that a law firm made that podcast required listening. I like that.
Yeah, no, because I think one of the things that really struck people is that they're not used to hearing people who are attorneys in the legal profession really talk about well-being. And somebody described it a bit like accountants, like we're all too busy, like at the big accounting firms or consulting firms, too busy working to really think about the impact of work on us.
Well, the good news about that is there are accounting firms that are thinking about that now, and the legal industry is definitely thinking about it. In fact, I was on a fireside chat with some folks, one of which was the chief wellness officer for Deloitte.
Oh,
And
wow.
she tells a great story about how she got that title. And it's because she wasn't well. And Deloitte was supportive, and she, went on her journey, and she came out on the other side in a good place. And now that's her job, is to actually
Mm.
focus on that inside the massive, organization that is Deloitte. So it's definitely something that is evolving. And in the legal industry, I have to tell you, I'm really excited because what's happening in legal is they are now calling it wellness instead of like lawyer assistance programs. And so the focus tends to be more on the positive, preventative, living your best life,
As opposed to picking you up by your bootstraps because you've fallen.
exactly right. And so I think more people are embracing the idea of wellness and well-being in the legal industry. Even people who in the past you would have said, yeah, they would never do that. I think people are embracing it now because the language, the whole mindset about it is shifting. And I think it's a shift into a very positive place.
Oh, that's awesome. A throwback to our previous episode. I remember, and I'm thinking about this in the context of belonging. You had talked about growing up sort of half white, half black in different kinds of communities. You talked about living in Boston and how the impact of that was and how different it was. In the because your dad was in the Air Force in those environments. And, I had talked about being black and at different times, like when I was in Atlanta and also when I was in Northern Virginia, growing up surrounded in white communities. And, I don't know if I talked to you about this, but I think, the church provided a sense of belonging for me at one point in life. My profession as a journalist provided, sense of belonging. Even sort of like the work I do or the podcast communities that I'm a part of provide some sense of that. And I was just wondering whether, your experiences growing up impacted or give you insight into the importance of or how to find a sense of belonging.
Yeah, so let me just, before I share that, say that having listened to a number of your podcasts, and especially the one, I think it was at the end of last year, it was kind of your recap podcast where you talked to a bunch of people that had been on in the past.
Yeah.
It was super obvious to me, by the way, and I want to call this out because you just mentioned it. It was super obvious to me that you have found a sense of belonging in the podcasting community, and in particular, in some of the true crime and other, subgenres within that podcasting community. I could hear it in your voice. I mean, it was super obvious to me.
Oh, that's interesting. And I think that's really borne out for me in the sense that I didn't realize, I don't want to say that something's missing, but I didn't even realize how important that was for me until, and you'll find this interesting in, October, and my mom died.
Yeah.
And that community, rallied to my support in those small ways that happen in the background but are so meaningful. And it just dawned on me, I am actually a part of a community here that I didn't even realize I was part of.
Yeah, no, it was, like I said, it was very clear to me listening to that year-end recap that that you're not just a part of it. It's a big part of you. You're a big part of it, and that you clearly feel like you belong. And so that, is maybe a segue into answering your question about, my growing up. My earliest experiences with belonging are mostly negative. You talked about Boston, so that's where my father's family was from. And although I didn't really live there, my brother and I would spend summers there when we were very young. And that was an environment, that I mentioned to you in the past, was in some ways kind of negative for me, in that, my brother and I weren't really accepted there. We were told that we were white kids, or we were Oreos, black on the outside and white on the inside, which in some ways was a fair comment because to that point of our lives, we had lived in majority white communities every single day of our lives, except for the summers that we might spend, in Roxbury, Massachusetts.
Mm.
And so, well, that was, as a small child, that's very confusing to have people say things like that to you. and not understand why in the military environment we were called black kids, and then in Roxbury we were called white kids or Oreos. That was very confusing. What wasn't confusing though was we both had a sense that we didn't fully belong in that community. And it was interesting because as I got older, so racial communities are an interesting thing when you are a mix of different races. Because as I got older, there was also plenty of times in my majority white communities where it was also very clear I did not belong. And so as a child, imagine how isolating that can be if the community that you primarily live in says you don't belong. And then the community that the majority community says you're part of, and you go to that community, they say you don't belong. That's kind of a tough place to be. Like, where do you belong?
Yeah, and it probably almost feels like the only place you belong is with maybe your family or your sibling or
Exactly. Like that nuclear family gets to be, kind of a big deal. And because of our military, lifestyle, we were a nuclear family. We didn't have this giant extended family that we saw all the time. I mean, I had relatives, but they were not living with us in Panama or living with us as we moved around the United States or overseas, to England for high school. And so as a result, that nuclear family was maybe one of the constants around a positive sense of belonging. And, you have siblings, you don't get along all the time. So sometimes that belonging isn't as great as you want it to be. Although I will admit that that was one of the places that occurred.
yeah.
On the positive side, one of the places where I started to observe things were different was certain sports teams that I played on. So I played soccer, I played baseball, I was a swimmer. And it's not that every sports team gave me a sense of belonging. In fact, the opposite would probably be more accurate. There were some, though, that did. And I started to realize after the fact, I didn't realize it in those moments. I just knew I felt different. But after the fact, I started to realize, something happened there that created that sense of belonging. And that I would look backwards and try to figure out as I age, what was it? One of the things I realized is, sometimes it was the efforts of one person to understand and embrace difference could make
Mm.
all the difference in the world. And sometimes it wasn't one person. Sometimes it was a group of people. Sometimes the entire culture, of an organization or a team might be about, embracing everybody. And therefore it's easy to feel like you belong when, you and everyone else who are very different are all being embraced. But there was other times where I think one individual was making the effort. And we'll probably talk about this later, but that was a lesson for me, is the reminder that like one person can actually make a huge difference in this whole idea about belonging.
It's really interesting that you say that because I can think of an example at work where, in my current job where we had, and Brittany, we had, when Brittany worked here, she left earlier this year to go, on to the next best thing for her. And one of the things I noticed when she was left was there was this glue that was missing that I didn't even realize she was providing. And then in that previous example, when my mom passed away, it really started with I realized that there were many people that were around me that were a part of that sense of community, but it really, really started with one person, one woman who is a listener who reached out after my mom died that made clear to me that I was a part of this community more than I even realized. And until you said that, I really hadn't thought about how the idea that when it comes to belonging, one person can make the difference or be the bridge or help open your eyes to it or can hold it together within the entire group. Because, one of the things, any large group that you're a part of, there's always gonna be someone who's negative or harmful, but they can be, I guess, crowded out by the culture of the group or an individual person or collective. That's interesting to me.
Yeah. And so what's really interesting about it is, like in my environment, the legal environment, all of the bigger law firms that I deal with, they have people, and they use different words, but you use the word glue, and a lot of them use that word. These are the sticky people. These are the people who help weave the fabric, the threads together into a fabric of the firm. And what's been fascinating to me from a cultural perspective is watching some of these firms grow and become overly focused on compensation. and especially compensating their rainmakers and making sure
Mm.
that rainmakers are paid at the top of the market, even though they're not billed at the top of the market. They don't perform at the top of the market, but they still feel like they should be paid at the top of the market. So as these firms focus on that, it's on some levels, it's a zero sum game. They're pulling, dollars from someplace else to pay these other people more. And, what happens is people who bill a lot but don't bring in business, they still generally do pretty well in some of these firms. But someone who brings in a little business, bills pretty well, but not great, and is the glue is often the person that gets forgotten when it comes to compensation, or at least
Ah.
neglected when it comes to compensation. And I've seen a couple examples of some of my regional law firm clients where they've had a series of these glue people leave. Some take early retirement, some just say, I'm done. Some actually just go into another profession. But if more than one leaves at once, it's often very palpable within the organization. Like, whoa, just like you said with Brittany, like, wow, it's different here.
Yeah, yeah. It's not where it's not the same anymore. And it's really interesting because I don't think I would have even picked up on it. I picked up on the fact that there's something special about her to our culture, but not that piece of it. And I wonder whether is there a way as organizations, as leaders of organizations, that we could even look to make sure we have those people? Like, because I don't even know if you could tell in a interview process, or you know what I mean? Like, is there a way? Is it? I wonder whether it's values too that play a big role in that.
I think values do play a big role in it, and those people who are sticky often have personal values that align with the organizational values, which is one of the reasons that they're willing to spend so much time and effort connecting with people, even though they rarely get paid for it. And by the way, when I say connecting with people, I don't mean just connecting with others so they have a bigger network. I mean, they are connecting people within the organization and helping them feel a sense of connection, which I think is one of those things that leads to a sense of belonging. And so those people are really important. And I think leaders can look for that in their organization. And then I think the way you start to interview for it is a little bit of reverse engineering, finding the people in your organization that you think are the sticky people, and then trying to observe what are the behaviors that they use, that they exhibit, that you think creates the stickiness. And then is there a way to test for or ask about those behaviors, in an interview process?
Oh, this is a really good point because, two things come to mind. One, I think it's so much of the little things, right? Like,
Yes.
you're the new person coming to the office, and the person that you're talking about says, oh, have you met this person? Or you seen this person? Or using Brittany as an example, she would do little things like go and arrange people's offices before they came in and take pictures of the different things that were in there, and her showing them what they were, or like suggesting ideas like, hey, let's all get together for, lunch in the office or whatever it was. And I don't know how you figure that out in an interview, but so when I hired for her replacement, the foundation of me hiring for her replacement was to look at her psychological assessment and look at her values profile. And I hired against that. So every person that was interviewed and made it as a finalist, we assessed and then compared it. And I think, it's not that the profile would have been the most defining factor, because obviously there's the interview, the resume, the life experiences that played a role in it. But the person who was hired to go into her position was the one that most matched her profile.
That's interesting. And you have the advantage too, Jason, of, using these assessment tools regularly in your business and then also using them on your business, using them with your own people. I think for employers that do not do this as a regular, part of their work, they can still observe behaviors and then look for those behaviors in people that they're interviewing. And one way to do it, for instance, just a simplistic way is, asking people that you're interviewing, in your last job, how many friends did you have there? And, if they've moved a lot, maybe ask them about their last 3 or 4 jobs. And, if it's one or two people, it's probably rare that they're the glue.
Yeah, yeah.
And it doesn't mean you would hire them for something. It just means that particular role is probably not what they're going to be best at. Finding out how they operate. So here's another really good example I think of where you didn't want to be careful with an assessment. So let's say you're using a personality assessment and you were looking at introversion and extroversion.
Hmm.
I think the predominant model would suggest the extrovert is going to be the person that is going to be really good at making people feel welcome and help them feel like they belong. They're going to be the glad hander. Hey, welcome to the firm. Come here. Let's go to lunch together. You should come out and join our softball team and all of that. The reality is, for a lot of folks, that introvert is probably going to be better. They're going to think very carefully about their connection with this new person. They're going to plan their interactions with the new person. And then most importantly, they're going to listen at a very intense level
Yes,
what the
yes.
person tells them. And then they're going to respond based on what they just heard, not what they thought they were going to hear, which is what, me, Joe, extrovert, I'm having 100 conversations at the same time and not listening carefully to any of them. The introvert can be really good. So I personally think that, from an employer perspective, who's trying to create glue, I wouldn't over rely on that larger than life person who is the life of the party, because they might be fun for everybody. It doesn't mean they're making everybody feel comfortable, safe, secure, belonging, in that organization. Whereas that introvert might be the person that makes you feel like you belong. They always ask you about this obscure hobby you have. They always ask you about something else that you do that's important to you that a lot of other people don't pay attention to.
It's interesting you say that because that's where I sort of think like personality and values play different roles. Like taking my own me as an example, when I get stressed out, I'm less of an extrovert, but the general me is pretty outgoing, engaging. But, my value of affiliation with people is very low. So, what I would say if I were to go and do my own analysis of me, I will come off in an interview as an extrovert. Chances are I will come off as an extrovert, but I communicate for the purposes of getting things done. I vigorously communicate for the purposes of getting things done. But that's not necessarily vigorously communicating for for a sense of belonging. However, when I get stressed out, I'm more likely to like pay attention and listen and hear those things. But in the normal me, the day to day me, you would perceive me as an extrovert, but you would be mistaken to think that I'm doing that to really. Mine's very goal oriented, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
it does make sense. And the more goal oriented you are, I think that in many cases, especially as you get out toward the extremes on this range, that in many cases you are losing the essence of the person, and therefore they don't feel as much like they belong. They don't feel as much as being included, because they're really just a cog in the machine at that point, a highly functioning machine, but a cog. And none of us want to be a cog. And so that's why I think it's important to always be able to, if you're in business to make money, you got to get results. And at the same time, I think you get better results if you can really focus on the individual and help them bring their authentic, selves to work, and and embrace that, and find ways to make it work for them and for the company, because then they're going to feel like they have that sense of belonging, to get more and better things from them.
I wonder whether those two things kind of run against each other, that every company does need very goal oriented, directed, decisive people in it. But they also need that glue that you're talking about to hold it together. And I imagine, we know from the research that it's those goal directed, outgoing people who tend to get noticed and get promoted, and that those who do, as one, um, we have an unconscious bias, right? Like if we don't see people who want to have high power careers or coming in with authority who are super outgoing, that might be a blind spot for us because of our unconscious biases that, hey, I was successful, so you'll be successful. And I think like, maybe the ideal person is a person who sort of, sees the big picture, is willing to help people out, uh, it really cares about helping others and also having people feel like they belong. Like, and I wonder whether how somebody, and I think the example I gave before is like, I didn't realize that this person was so key to our sense of belonging. I wonder how someone like me and I'm in this profession, right? I'm in the profession of analyzing these things and understanding that diversity is important. But I wonder how somebody like me even gets to the point where we recognize the importance of it. I have a friend, I quoted her recently, and she said to me that you don't figure out how a clock works by looking at a clock that's working. You look at a broken clock. Um, and I wonder whether for someone like me, seeing the absence of it helps me reverse engineer this thing I need or that we need as a team.
I think seeing the absence of it at a bare minimum is going to remind you the importance of it. Like you can compare and contrast organizations and go like, wow, this organization has a lot of sticky people and they seem like they function better. They have less turnover, for instance. They have higher
Yeah.
productivity rates. They have more innovation, and creativity. And so those are things that if you see the absence of it, it's probably going to cue you that, hey, Jason, you need to start focusing on how do we get more of that. And I think that, one of the things that's challenging is if you have an organization built around people who are completely focused on relationships and then other people who are completely focused on getting things done and think by having the two together, it's going to solve your problems. I think what happens is under stress, both groups default to, their default mechanism. So the relationship person is going to default to relationships and the results person is going to default to results. And the danger of that, from my perspective, is the results people in particular can say and do things where there's no intention behind them, but the impact is devastating.
Oh,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
I actually would want my results people to still have the ability to understand the power of relationships and be able to flex their own style where
Hmm.
appropriate and focus on that relationship and
Yeah.
focus on belonging rather than saying I have a separate relationship person from my results person.
What's really funny, John? The way one of the ways that I address this, I moved my office around, so my desk was no longer in the corner of my office that was further to the door. It was right up in front of the door, and I still will close it at times, but I want to signal to people, and I face the door now, and I'm really close to it. So I want to signal to people that I'm available to them because my body language or the way that my office was set up. Kind of ran against that. So, but when I am really stressed out, what I will do is I will schedule time to just reach out to people, just schedule time to walk the halls. Because I know it's not naturally going to come to me. And by putting it on the calendar, hopefully they haven't figured out what time it is, but by putting it on the calendar, it gives me this opportunity to do it.
No, I think that's a really smart idea. So there's many people who, the idea of management by walking around, is actually fairly popular. And there's some people they just naturally do that. And what you're pointing out is you don't naturally do that. And so for you, what's most important is that you do put in the calendar so that you actually do it. And what you've learned over the years, and the reason you put it in your calendar is it works.
Yep. Yep. And it has, yeah, you see the impact. I remember, I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but I'm trying to think when this was. It may have been in the second year of the pandemic. I was on the phone with this sort of like expert in business development who's done some work for us. And the topic of childhood came up, and she had been adopted. She had, had a relatively difficult childhood. She had gone off to do human rights work during the war in Yugoslavia, and probably had some traumatic experiences there. And we were just talking about childhood, and I was telling her about my childhood, and I mentioned that when I was a kid or a teenager, I had been a part of church communities my whole life. And my family, a lot like your family, because my dad worked for the federal government, we moved a lot, right? But the constant was we were part of these church communities, youth groups. And I had said like one of the toughest moments of being young for me was when, I had started asking questions because I'm just a naturally inquisitive person of our Sunday school teacher, and she couldn't answer them. So then the Sunday school director came in and he gave his answer, which to me like wasn't logical, didn't make sense. And very nicely, I pointed it out to him, and he basically said, not basically, he actually said, the devil causes division. And that was the beginning of my walk away from the church, that one little
Yeah.
moment. And she said, it's a big deal because it tethered your sense of belonging. It ripped your sense of belonging. And I had never really even thought about that idea. And then later in my career, when I uh, made my mistakes in journalism and had to leave that community, I lost and I didn't even know it, lost another sense of belonging and identity and connection. And, you know, I realized in retrospect that even though I didn't know it, I was seeking a sense of belonging. But I also realized I may not always know how to create that sense of belonging for people, even though it's really important for me.
I think it's an important point. It's important for each of us, and it's important we find ways to help create it, in others. I think your friend was, spot on that, when we lose these places that are important to us, where we, for me, the idea of belonging is part of it is I can feel so comfortable someplace I can just be myself, whatever that is. And there may be other things like for you and your faith community, there may be, concepts there that were really important to you. And then as you saw contradictions, like comment that was made, it starts to take you out of that, community, and you no longer feel as comfortable, and you no longer feel like you belong in the same way. And that's a big loss.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and it's almost sort of like an unexpected one because you move on to the next thing. And actually, right around that time, just thinking about this for the first time, it's kind of like when I found journalism as a career, and that kind of took over, right? Took over in comparison. But maybe that wound wasn't entirely healed. I mean, I know we're driven for this need, right? Your point before about introverts or extroverts, it's easy to think of the extrovert that way, but I think that we're all relational people. Like the way that we understand ourselves, the way that we understand other people, the way that we get things done through other people is all about belonging. And I think of a recent example that I've run into with this friend of mine who probably for the first time in her life feels a sense of belonging in a place. But I also think the it's an unhealthy place because for a lot of different reasons, I think it actually in some ways makes her life harder, right? And so I've been wondering recently and thinking about her because I don't want to say to her, "Hey, you need to leave this community." Like maybe you need to get away from a couple people in the community. But like, how do you find that balance of your need for belonging, and balance that with your own well-being? Like, I can think of another example where you may get your identity from helping people, but you lose yourself. That's another example that comes to mind. And people are so afraid in those situations. I know from working with leaders that if they stop helping people, all of a sudden they'll lose their place of belonging. And I just wonder, like, how do we find those places of belonging that are safe, or how do we turn those places of belonging into safer or healthier places when that balance isn't right?
Yeah, it's a great question because, you gave a good example there of what I would call maybe a middle ground, yet still an appropriate place where you get a great sense of your identity out of helping others, and then you can lose your sense of self, right? Because where I went when I was first, talking to you about this whole idea is things like cults and hate groups that
Mm.
provide a sense of, identity, a sense of belonging for people who are feeling like they don't belong someplace. And in that sense of belonging is then turned and used to do some very dangerous and I think we both agreed bad things. And so your example is a better one because it's something that, more of us would probably see. And I think one of the things that helps us in these middle ground areas, like the person who, really identifies with helping others and then loses themselves, is to be in community with folks who feel comfortable that, you get to be you and I get to be me. And part of being me is sharing what I observe about you.
Mm.
You don't have to buy it.
Yeah.
However, if we're in community, you need to hear it. And
And
so I
appreciate
can be
it.
that person that says to you, Jason, I've noticed that you really take great joy in supporting other people, on your team. And yet I also noticed that in the last 2 years, I've not seen you do anything for Jason.
Mm.
You know, is that something that you've, focused on?
Oh,
And
that's very, it's funny you say that because I have a friend at work who's like, so this has been like the year of vacations for me. I went to Ireland. I went to, oh, I'm going to Minnesota. I'm going to Salem for October. Where am I going? Or I've gone. I took a trip to Indiana. I've taken so many trips in part because my mom said right before she died, she said, live your life. Um,
good.
so
That was good
eh,
advice.
yeah, excellent advice. Yeah. And, I have this friend at work who mentioned, I've been pointing out for the last 5 years, because we've worked together for 8 years, that every time you have a vacation, you cancel it to go deal with a fire or to help someone out or do something. And I feel like the combination of my mom's advice and this friend, Abby, who her advice, helped me find a better balance.
So I think that's what we need. And for me, that's part of belonging. So being authentically you, I think of that as being the best version of me, not the current version of me. And hopefully I'm evolving
Mm.
into, my best version. So I actually appreciate it if somebody would say something like that to me, like, hey, John, I've noticed that every time you have a big vacation coming up, you cancel it to put out a fire for someone else. Because the
Yeah.
best version of me is going to be a whole version, which means I have to explore. I have to seek out new things. I have to learn. I have to relax. All the things that I can do on a vacation that I'm not going to do day. I mean, I'm going to learn every day at work, but it's very, very different. And so I think that, this whole notion of being authentic, your authentic self and bringing your authentic self to work doesn't mean that you have to accept or want to accept, limitations, warts, whatever they happen to be. It can be that your authentic self is evolving constantly, probably, hopefully, and that it's okay to be in an environment where people support you enough that they want to at least raise different perspectives with you or point out, some observations where you can then make a determination. Does that work for me? Does that fit for me? Is that valuable, information to have? And like in your case, Jason, it sounds like that was helpful that somebody pointed out to you that you
Yeah. Oh,
canceling these important vacations to help someone else put out a fire.
yeah, and I feel like I've come back to work, more effective. And in retrospect and thinking about it, I think it was like a merging of my desire to help people with fear that if I didn't do this thing, like show up for people or put fires out or whatever, this fear that I would lose my identity. And I think I realized, what? I was also undermining other people, right? And their sense of connection to the organization. And, I was accidentally sending the message, I don't trust you to put out a fire. And guess what? Over every one of my vacations, sure, there were fires in the last year. And guess what? My team put them out without a problem at all. And so, I was unintentionally sending the message, I don't trust you, right? Which undermined their connection with the organization. And so I'm just thinking like when you have those moments where you're operating out of fear, whatever that fear may be, right? Because it doesn't have to be the one that I have, that it can undermine uh, connections within an organization or any group of people, friends, whatever it might be, family.
Not only does it undermine it, so your need to belong is tied to identity, and part of your identity at the time was I put out fires for other people, and unfortunately, that helps you start to lose self, right? And that's what Abby is pointing out to you in that situation. And so I think all of us have to be careful to not allow our sense of identity to get so tied to something that may not be the best thing for us. And again, I keep coming back to this phrase, bringing your authentic self to work because it's used a lot, these days in the workplace. I don't think that phrase is a license to just carry your baggage forward. It's
Right.
to solve that baggage. And you said something earlier about a wound hadn't healed. And I was at a coaching conference last year, and I heard this phrase that was awesome. They said, you want to teach from your scars, not from your wounds.
Right. The ones that have healed. Yeah.
Boy, did that make a lot of sense to me. 'Cause
Yeah.
I see these people who are dealing with, some trauma or something, and they're trying to help others, and they haven't resolved their own things yet. And so often I perceive that as like just icky or inappropriate at best. And what I was hearing from these colleagues at this coaching conference is when you've gotten to the point of resolution, there's still a scar there. You can't ignore what happened, but you've learned to process it, and you can put it in a context
Mm-hmm.
and then learn and build from that, as opposed to being in the throes of the thing, the wound, where you don't have the same context. You don't have the ability to stand on it and scaffold up, build up from there. And so it's one of those things that I think is really helpful is when somebody can point out to you that perhaps there's a wound, there's something that's going on for you. You can then decide if you want to do something about that. And if you do and you resolve it, you can get to the point where now you've got a asset. That scar is an asset. You've learned something and you can do something different, both with yourself and with others, moving into the future. Whereas the wound, it's not an asset. It's a deficit at this point. Until you have healed the wound, it's actually detracting from you in most cases.
It reminds me of that phrase, like, put the oxygen mask on
Yep.
yourself for someone else. Like, look inside and then build up. I love that. I love the scar versus wound metaphor. I was going to ask you, what do you think the cost is to groups of people or organizations or teams that don't focus on building that sense of belonging? And I kind of think of that in the context of like, probably post COVID, thinking about all the changes that happened with remote work and, did that get tethered? And then even all those changes that happened with return to work. I wonder whether that's given us some insight in that or exasperated it, or what do you think happens when groups don't build that sense of belonging?
I think it's a big deal. And I think we have a little bit of research on this. Maybe there's a lot. I just haven't seen it, but at least there's some. One of the things that I think that we know about belonging is that it can help fuel productivity. So if you don't have a sense of belonging, your productivity goes down. So from a purely mercenary standpoint, as a business leader, not creating a sense of belonging in your people is going to end up in reduced productivity. And you may be happy with your current level of productivity. However, if you can get more, and you don't have to spend more money to make people feel like they belong, you have to spend time, but not necessarily money. It doesn't have to be a lot of time sometimes.
Right.
So I think the productivity is one that gets a lot of business people's attention. Another big one that HR is always focused on is turnover. If I don't belong, and I know I don't belong, I'm going to try to find a way to meet that need. Like we all have that need to belong. So I'm going to try to find a way to get that need met. And eventually I'm going to realize I have to find it somewhere else and I'm going to leave. And so that creates turnover. And in a down economy, it may take me a long time to decide to leave because I'm scared that I don't have any other choice. I'd rather be in a bad place than no place. As the economies, get better, or as my skill set increases or becomes more valuable in a particular market, I have more opportunities. And so turnover can happen quickly. And, depending on the skill level of a person, a clerical worker can still cost you 150% of their salary sometimes
Right.
to get them replaced. And think about your highest end knowledge workers. They're way more expensive than that to get them replaced. And the total dollars is even higher too. So the turnover is another thing that I think kind of let's say your results oriented business leader might look a lot at. I think another factor, though, that's even more important, it's a little harder to quantify, and that is creativity. When you don't feel like you belong, you don't bring your best, self to work. You don't bring your
Ideas,
best
right.
ideas to work. And so there's not that, diversity and intersection of all of these, creative influences coming together. Like there may be one person who's being creative and everyone else is like, okay, tell me what to do with that. I'll go make it happen.
And
Whereas
and I imagine like another example is like, there is a cost to taking a risk. Am I, if I don't feel a sense of belonging, going to be willing to walk out a little bit further on that on that diving board? If
it's
I
a great
don't,
analogy because yes, and again, that's something we know from science is there's a risk reward, spectrum here. And the biggest rewards are going to come from taking some risks. And, being innovative is almost always taking a risk. And so if you're in an environment where you feel that psychological safety, you're going to have a sense of belonging and you'll be willing to take those risks. And most importantly, you'll take them day after day after day. It's not
Right.
taking a risk once in a blue moon. That's not likely to hit the right confluence of other people taking risks too, and like come, these ideas come crashing together, and yet something totally new comes from the crash of ideas. If you do it on a regular basis, it's much more likely that at some point we get 1 + 1 = 3.
And I wonder whether this is even more important than like things, people being nice, right? Because, conflict avoidance doesn't always have its upside. But when I think of companies like, I don't know, Apple, or I think of companies that where people really, top law firms, or people feel a real sense of connection to the organization and feel safer, they may bring more, if that makes sense.
I think they always bring more. Yes, absolutely. And in some levels, it's almost free. Like you're not paying them extra to bring more.
Right.
You're
Right.
giving them something that makes them bring more, which is that sense of belonging. And you can consciously focus on that to create a better sense of belonging, I think. That, though, is not giving somebody more money to now be more innovative in your organization.
Do you think that people can build a sense of belonging regardless of what level they are in an organization, like non-leaders, leaders?
I do. In fact, I would argue that everyone needs to be a leader. So leaders for me, are not about titles. It's about roles. Do you influence and do you impact other people? If you do, in my book, you're a leader. And so the person, so I'll give you an example. Sylvia, she's the receptionist at a law firm, client of mine in Washington, D.C. Sylvia is not just welcoming. Like that's what you expect a receptionist to be.
Right.
Welcoming. She actually makes you feel like you belong. She makes you feel like you're part of that organization, part of that law firm. And think about this. Most people that she runs into on a daily basis are writing massive checks to this law firm. So making them feel like they're part of it is a gift. Because
Yeah.
normally they're bringing a problem and they're writing a really big check.
Yeah. Probably a stressful problem and paying out for it. Right.
Exactly. And she is, I watch her and she is very, very clever at what she does. And by the way, sincere. This is not a game. This is who she is. Um, but it's something that she does. And so I think that, and I point this out to this firm all the time. I'm not sure they always listen to me because I'm basically saying you should write her a nice bonus check. Just say thank you and do something nice for her. And she is really impactful. And the reason I pay attention to this is I watch how she deals with me when I'm there. And she literally treats me like I'm a member of this firm. I'm not. I sell them services, right? So they're writing me a check. However, she makes me feel like I am a member of the firm. And one of my favorite stories about her is this. I can see National Airport from their offices, and I often fly in and out of, DCA. And so there's been times she's come into me and said, hey, Mr. John, I think it's time that we stop your meetings because I know you want to get home and see your wife. And if we don't get you out of here soon, you are not going to catch your flight. She says
Wow.
it in the nicest, sweetest way, but she's
Yeah.
managing me. And she's
Yeah.
managing me, though, in a way where I know she cares because she understands these other parts of my life, not just what I do for her firm. And she wants to make sure those parts of my life are going well.
I remember when I first started doing mental health work and, I was starting my business, I had, a colleague who said, the most important thing is who you hire at the front desk because they interact with people more than you ever will. They interact with more family members than you ever will. And that who that person is really holds together everything. And I never really even thought of that. But when I started doing it over time, like I realized that I would find out things about my clients' progress from the person at my front desk that they would never even say to me and that was fascinating to see.
Well, some firms do this with hiring too. They will ask, like in New York, the car service driver. They use the same car services and they often have similar drivers. They'll ask them for feedback on the candidates they have. They ask the receptionist for feedback on the candidates they have. They ask the legal assistant who is escorting them, around all their different appointments that day for feedback because those people are seeing things and learning things that that you may not learn in your kind of elevated level. And the other thing that I take away from that is not only are they good sources of information, those are people that can help others feel like they belong. And those are people who can tell you that the candidates you're bringing in don't care about creating a sense of belonging in the organization. They care about themselves.
Oh, that's fascinating. It brings to mind this story. Our company worked with the Defense Health Agency, and I remember the first day we ever went in the building to meet Vice Admiral Raquel Bono, who was the director of this massive agency, right? Like 100,000 plus agency. And we sat down with her because our program was an initiative that she really cared about. And we were sitting in the small conference room. I think there were like 7 people on my team there, right? Like people who were backbenching on the wall, people who were at the conference table. And I did most of the talking, and one of my other colleagues who worked at Korn Ferry International did most of the talking. Last thing she did in the meeting, and we had about 10 minutes left, she stopped us from talking and she went around the room and asked everyone, her people, my people, their views. So it was everyone from the senior consultants who were talking to literally to the administrative assistant that was on the back bench. And she didn't just in a perfunctory way ask them. She asked them follow-ups. She asked them, and my team has never had more loyalty to a client than that one. And I think it's because they felt like they were a part of it.
Yeah, that's a great story because it shows you, it gives you an example of why belonging is so important and also how easy it is to do. So, one of the things I was going to say to you, Jason, in terms of like leadership, I don't think you have to be a formal leader to make belonging, your issue. But I do think leaders need to model it. And then more importantly, find champions, people in their firm who have a propensity to want to, do this, that's what they like to do. It's part of their DNA. And then find other people who may be around the fence about it that you can tip over and also do it. So you can get more people focused on it. Your story, though, is a great example of one way to do that in a very professional context. Ask people their opinion.
Yeah. And the interesting thing for me is I've rarely seen leaders do it. And it was very funny because I like instantly started copying it as a part of my approach to do it. And it I think it really, 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 really truly makes a big difference. One of the things that I was also wondering about and kind of thinking about this piece of it, you had mentioned earlier that some of this can be cultural, not just the individual. Um, is there something you can do to help build a culture from your perspective, whether you're leaders or other people, to build it into the culture? I guess modeling. I guess you were kind of getting at that, modeling the behavior.
Modeling it and also calling it out, though, so people understand. So sometimes when you model things, it's too subtle. People don't always
Yeah.
connect the dots. And it's okay if you're not trying to get them to follow your behavior. You just want them to see that you do something a particular way. But if you want them to follow your behavior and repeat your behavior, you need to connect the dots. And so I think that besides modeling it is you tell people what we want. So I had an experience recently where I was exposed to a private club. And this is not my scene at all. Like when I was a young lawyer, all the partners I worked with belonged to clubs. And we'd go to the club and I'd see people who looked like me and they were wearing black pants and a white shirt and carrying a tray. And, it was just awkward for me. And I never liked them. And I just recently had this experience where, a friend wanted to introduce me to another friend and it was going to be in this club. And it was so interesting to me because the culture clearly a tone has been set that we want to make people feel comfortable here, regardless of whether they're a member or not, regardless of whether they look, act, think like us.
Oh, that's
It
fascinating.
was fascinating to me because I went into it with a bias against private clubs, first of all. I mean, I'll just be honest, not my thing. And almost to a person that I met, people were very warm, very welcoming. And then if somebody found out I had never been to this club before, like, oh, well, let me tell you this really cool thing that we have. You should go check this out. And they then were basically going above and beyond just being polite and literally trying to engage me around opportunities. And they weren't trying to pitch me on being a member of the club. That was not ever going to be a possibility. They just wanted me to know that there was these things that I might find interesting based on whatever I just said to them, whether it's I'm never been here before or I expressed an interest in something. And I really found it interesting. And I'm going to debrief with my friend. This is very recent, so I haven't had a chance to debrief yet. Uh, but I'm going to ask the question, like, is this something that they do intentionally with their new members so they understand that is what we want to be part of this organization's culture, that we are welcoming to everybody, whether they're a member or not? My guess is they're going to come back and tell me, absolutely.
Wow. So you really think that those kinds of things are like intentionally embedded in, it's not just the people, it's that there's an expectation and an explanation of the purpose of it.
I think so, especially in this case. I really feel strongly that it's intentional because it's a private club where most people will never be able to be a member of the club. And so on some level, you don't have to care what somebody thinks when they come and go because they're not likely to be there very often unless they're doing business with you, in that club again over and over. And that was not even remotely the experience I had. It was almost like we're not a private club. We're the welcome wagon for your local neighborhood. We want you to, come and explore the neighborhood.
Everything's actually open here, regardless of, well, and that leads to another question, like how important is valuing diversity to this?
I think for belonging, it's critical because it's forget what you believe about diversity. If you have an organization that's more than about two or three people, you're going to end up having people with various types of diversity, racial, ethnic, religious, gender, sexual orientation, thinking, political, all sorts of different things. And if you can't find ways to create environments where people, it's not just that they're included, this is why I like belonging so much, but where they actually feel like they belong, you can't leverage that reality. I mean, you may have them working for you, diverse people working for you, but they're not giving you their best. You're not
Right.
getting their best ideas. You're not getting their best work. You're not getting their best creativity. And so it's just a reality in the United States, at least, that once you get past about three people, it's pretty rare that you would not start to see various types of diversity showing up in your employee base.
Yeah. And without appreciation for that, I mean, you can balkanize things pretty easily, right?
You can, and again, you can get away with it. There's companies that do. The challenge is you're still paying people for less than what they could be bringing to the table because you've made a choice that you're not going to focus on this.
And so there's a real sort of like disconnection that can happen between the investment and the people, whatever you might consider that investment, time, money, whatever it may be, a disconnection between the investment and the what they bring to the table.
Yeah, I think it's the disconnection between your initial investment and then the rate of return on that investment. So the initial investment is I spend time hiring you, screening you, hiring you, onboarding you, and then paying you and getting you to go to work. That's my initial investment. And what you do for me over the course of this next year is whatever that is, right? If you would put a little bit more investment in there in helping this person feel like they belong, you will get a much higher rate of return because they will bring their best much more often. They will share their best ideas. They won't just mail things in. Like when you feel like you belong someplace, there's a sense of reciprocity, of mutuality that goes on. You and I don't have to be the same, but if we feel like we're part of the same community, I will try to help you be better and you'll try to help me be better. And that's where we start moving toward that, what I talked about before, 1+1 = 3.
Right.
That's
Right.
when magic happens, when you get 1+1 = 3. Magic doesn't happen when 1+1 = 2.
Which is the whole point of us being in groups, that we're better together. Otherwise, we'd all be independent operators.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So for me, this is one of the reasons that I now like talking to some of my organizations about belonging, and I purposely don't use any of the science, although there is a bunch out there.
Mm-hmm.
I purposely don't, because what I really want people to take away and to think about is this can literally be one of the easiest things you do in your day. What can
Yeah.
I do to make one person, and you can just target somebody, your assistant, the person at the front desk, someone in the mailroom. What can I do today to help them feel like they belong And then can I repeat that on another day and another day? And you don't have to do it every single day. However, you start to figure out like what works. What are those person's needs? Are there appropriate ways to meet those needs in this, office environment? If there are, that's one of the ways I can help create this sense of belonging.
That's a really good point, because all it really does is focusing on one person. Because it seems so daunting when you think about it in the bigger picture. But
I think
I
it's
think,
not.
yeah, when you come back to what you were saying before, that sometimes it's one person who does it. What happens when it's 100 people doing it for one person? That's where it can become really powerful. I was just wondering, just sort of like in thinking about all of this, do you have any sort of like closing thoughts or a message you would want people to take away about belonging?
Yes, I do. I think that, people talk about the importance of, diversity, equity, inclusion, and now they add belonging there. And I think belonging is the one that is in some ways the easiest to do and the least controversial. For me, belonging is, being interested enough in another person to engage them around their stuff, whatever that happens to be. And again, I mean their appropriate stuff, so that they feel like they can bring that, into the environment we're in, whether it's work or a social organization, or a charity or whatever we happen to be doing. And that doesn't take a heck of a lot of effort. It takes intentionality, by the way. It does take intentionality for most of us. I'm not wired that way. I have to think
Yeah.
about it, but it doesn't take a huge amount of effort. It just takes a little bit of thought. And so one of the ways I do it is in environments where I feel very comfortable myself. I tend to be much better at helping other people feel like they belong. And one of my kind of growth edges, for the future is really trying to ally myself with people in places where I don't feel as comfortable, where I don't feel like I belong that much. Because my theory is they may not either. And together we can create an environment where we do belong.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. This has been an awesome conversation, man. I'm looking forward to at some point having you back on, and, looking forward to continuing our working relationship together, because we can say a lot of things about you, but smart, thoughtful guy is one that definitely fits. So,
Well, I appreciate that, Jason. And I love working with you. We've had some fun times together, and I'm definitely looking for more of those, down the road. And I love the podcast. In fact, I told you before, I am so intrigued by all the twists and turns that your podcast has taken. And
yeah,
it's exciting. I mean, it's confusing to me, and yet it's exciting at the same time.
yeah, no, absolutely. Like, it's nothing, nothing like what I thought the journey would be. And I suspect the next year will not be like anything that I anticipate right now. And yeah, and it's been really meaningful. It's that part of life where, you can plan all you want and you can prepare all you want. But if you sort of like open your ears and walk on a path, you'll find where you're supposed to be, not where you plan to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that.
If you would like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-driven Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.